All right, folks, so we're going to talk today about the Get Data feature in Excel. So the first thing to keep in mind is that I actually can't do this step in the Office 365 version of Excel that you access through the browser when you're logged into your Office 365 account. So this step won't work. Yes, there are ways I can get and transform data while in Excel in the browser. That is actually from Picture or from Power BI at this point is what is supported there. So just to call that out, if you are currently using Excel in the browser, you're going to have to pause this video, go ahead and open up Excel on your desktop, and then you can move on to this next step. All right, so if I am on a PC, or sorry, if I'm on a Mac OS, I will have a slightly different GUI or graphical user interface than I will if I'm the PC version of Excel. Okay, so regardless of which one I am on, when I open up Excel, I'm going to come on over here to the Data tab. I'm going to click on the Data tab, and then I'll get this pop-up over here where I have a down chevron next to the Get Data. It's this little column here with a little spreadsheet icon next to it. And I would click on Get Data from Power Query. If I am on a PC, Microsoft Office products are built for PCs, so my functionality, my features are much, there's a greater breadth of them. I will still also, though, click on this Data tab over here. I'll come and click on the Get Data. You'll see the icon is very similar, though the GUI is slightly different. I'll click on From File, and then from, in this instance, I'm pulling a CSV, so from Text CSV. Where do I find this data? Well, if you're not in my class and you need to go download it yourself, you can follow this website address, kaggle.com/datascience/data-science-jobs-salaries/data, and you will find this information. You can also look at the data card there if you want to have a better idea on what variables we're working with. We'll see in this step that we're going to actually edit the experience level variable from this EN that we see here to entry level once we pull that data into Excel as a transform step. So if you want to find that data, that's where it is. All right, so let's go ahead and let's get our data. What we will do once we've got Excel open is we will come on over here, click Get Data. You see From File, from Text CSV. Now I already have this data saved on my computer, so I'm going to navigate to the folder where it is. You'll see how it looks in its raw format right there, and I'm going to click Open. It's going to connect to it. It's going to ask me what delimiter I'm using. In this case, it is comma. It assumed it correctly based on the data, first 200 rows that it detected. I've told it to do the entire data set, and I'm good to go at this point. I'm going to now transform this data really quickly. I'm just going to make one or two edits to this data set because I want to quickly transform it from these really generic variables like MI to middle management, so I know what experience level I'm working with here. I'm going to do the same thing for SE, do senior executive. You can transform and make edits to your data to your heart's content based on what level of granularity or comfortability you have. I'll do EN for entry level, and then my EX, which is my executive. And how these are defined, we don't necessarily know what the boundary is, but we're going to go with it. Okay? Now from here, we want to go ahead and load our data into our active data model into our spreadsheet so that we can use it. Okay? You'll see that I actually did quite a bit of transforming here, mostly because I want to actually use a map, and so in order for the map to work, I'm going to have to make some edits to the country level variable because the Excel program needs the fully correctly spelled country and not just the abbreviated ISO code that it's given me. All right, let's go ahead and load this now to our spreadsheet. I'm going to make sure and select that Add to the Data Model and click OK. Now, I do this because it's going to save me a whole lot of time later. If you forget to do it, it's not a huge deal. There's other ways, but for the purpose of this demonstration, this is how I'm going to show you. All right, from this 607 rows of data, we'll see on that right-hand side our queries and connection window popped up. I'm going to go ahead and now insert a pivot table from this data model really quickly into a new spreadsheet. Click on where I want it and click OK. All right, so you'll now see over here on our pivot table fields, Mark, we're able to edit the columns and the rows of our data. We're able to pull some values down. I'm going to work with the salary actually, see how many people I have. Let's count first how many people are in our data set. Okay, so these are the number of people that have responded to this particular set of data that was aggregated and we're now using for the purposes of this exercise. All right, I'll see that data scientist, data engineer, data analyst, machine learning engineer, and research scientist are kind of my most represented job titles in this set of data. But if you were to look through this, you'll see there's also various variations like lead data analyst or applied data scientist that could relatively just kind of all be part of the same data scientist short moniker. So we will do data cleanup in a different step, but for the purposes of Excel, which Excel is actually not great at data cleanup, we're gonna make this data set just a tiny bit smaller while we're trying to figure out what we want to look at. So I'm just gonna look at part-time because I knew there's very few part-time folks represented, only 10 in this data set, part-time folks. So now let's go ahead and we'll build our table out a little bit before we add our filter back in and open it up. So I'm going to look at actually the average salary that folks have in these different job titles for part-time work. And from here, I want to start to consider what kind of edits I might make. So we're going to move from pivot tables into simple charts now. So, in this step, I noticed that I actually want to first change the way in which the data shows up. Okay, so I'm going to change this to a currency. I'm going to click OK. And now I very clearly know this is actually a salary. It doesn't look like a very ambiguous number anymore. So I feel a little bit better about what this means for me graphically and how I'm going to show it. Now that I feel more comfortable, I'm going to do a little bit of sorting based on average highest salary up top. Again, this is a very small data set, so at the moment we're not doing too much, but it does kind of help us get a sense on how we might want our information to be shown visually. So let's see, I'm now going to add salary as a filter. And realize that's actually, nope, not what I wanted to do. I want to look at the minimum and maximum next to my average. Okay, so I'm going to go through that same process all over again. I'm going to add this here. I'm going to adjust the value field settings to tell it I want the minimum. Okay, and I also want it to be shown as a currency. All right, there we go. Now I've got maximum salary, and now I'm going to do minimum right here. All right, same thing. I'm going to change the format of the data point so that it shows up as a currency, and here we go. All right, now I'm going to open this back up. Let's just take a look. We're going to look at contract, how many contractors in the database, but we did less. We only got 5. All right, so they're not really telling us much here. It's the same value for each of these. The average is the max is the min because we only have one data point. All right, so let's look. How about FL, whatever that means? We have to look back at our data catalog to know there's only 4 of them. No. Maybe freelance, I'm guessing. All right, let's look at full-time. All right, so the overwhelming, again, majority of our data set is this. Let's sort this based on the highest max salary and see what we get. So it looks like the highest paid person is a principal data engineer. They get $600,000. Research scientist comes next, and then our directors and things like that. All right, so this is still the bulk of our data set. We'll see it goes all the way down to 2,000 is the lowest paid full-time person, which I'm sure there's some level of data error in here too. All right, let's look at this information visually. Let's see now, because we have this whole pivot table here, we can click on insert charts, show all charts, and it'll give us some suggestions, and it'll make some assumptions about what columns of data we might want to automatically show. So I could show a line for the average, the max, and the minimum salaries, and then have a count on the number of people that are represented in the data next to it. It might not work. I'm going to drop some of this data off myself. Let's see, I don't want the count in there anymore, so I'll do this as a clustered bar. I'll do max and minimum salary as a line, and I'll have the average shown as a bar column and see how this looks. We're just exploring at this point. We're getting familiar with How do we create charts from pivot tables in Excel? All right, so this is still kind of busy for me. I'm going to filter this down by company size a little bit more. I'll go in here, I'll select multiple items, and I'll say small. So you'll see my data is changing as my filters are changing. Now I've got a much smaller table. You know, this feels a little bit more manageable for me. I can still see that there are, you know, a difference between the max and minimum salaries that we can see here. So great. I'm going to sort this again because I want this to still be a little bit more visually appealing, and I'm going to do the highest average sorted descending, and now we'll see that because the average salary is my bar, my column, it's going to sort that from left to right descending. All right, so I think we're pretty good at this point on this. Let's see what other elements of our chart we could add. So if I come up here and I click on the active chart itself, you'll see 3 additional tabs pop up. I've got the pivot chart analyze, the design, and the formula. So I'm in the design tab right now, specifically for this pivot chart, and I'm adding different elements to it. So I'm seeing here this actually shows up really poorly, so I'm going to drop these zeros after the decimal point, make that a little bit easier to read. That way there's not as many zeros going on there. I could abbreviate it further if I wanted to with custom settings, but for the purposes of this exercise, I'll just do this one. Okay, cool. All right, so that's a little bit easier to read, not as busy. I can change the coloring if I wanted to from here. I could, you know, reorder the way in which the information is shown. So in this one now, I've put the max column, the max salary is the column, which, you know, it changes the way the data is visualized. All right, so let's change our colors if we wanted to, select a different palette. You know, this is all available to you here. You could select a different chart style if you want a darker background or a lighter background. This is all entirely up to you, and things that you should change and edit, because my graph shouldn't look like your graph, and your graph shouldn't look like anybody else's graph because it's your unique titles and preferences. Make sure you add a title so that we know what we're looking at. Give us some sense. For example, these are full-time average salaries at small companies. Let me just confirm that because, you know, I've been moving through, yep, small companies. You know, I could even go further, add additional filters if I wanted to. So, yep, make sure that it's fully descriptive. So we'll do salaries for jobs in data science. And then I'll do a second row here and say active filters applied so that it's really clear that, like, I've already filtered this data down, but there is, you'll see we still have the ability to add things back in. So if this title isn't dynamic, then I want to make sure that folks know when they come here what they are looking at, or they come to my graphic, if you will. All right, so the last thing that I'll do is I'm just going to add the country of residence to as a filter, so that way, you know, if I wanted to say, for example, I don't know, show only the data points in Kenya. Let's see what we got here. Oh, we've only got one data point, so that may not be the best one, but, you know, here's the way in which if I wanted to look at a particular country or a specific slice of my data, I could do that. All right, so let's now look at, instead of creating this, you know, bar line chart, which, you know, is not the most visually appealing graph in the world, and that's fine. This is our first graph where it can be ugly. As long as it shows something and we can figure out what we're looking at, we will deal with design later. Let's look at what it might be to create a map in Excel. All right, so we can quickly generate maps from a data model in Excel with the caveat that our data needs to be properly defined. So in this example, we're going to see that actually when we imported this data, it used a short ISO code for the country, which creates a problem because Excel doesn't know ISO codes. It actually knows countries based on its properly spelled name. So as we go through the process of creating a map here, we're going to see that some of these have been properly spelled, some haven't. We've done a little bit of manual data cleanup in the transform step that we saw in the prior video. We'll learn later in the semester how to actually use pandas to do this very quickly, to join two other tables. We could use in SQL as well if we wanted to, if we had an index or a key. But for the purpose of this exercise, I've already edited some of the data for you, so you would have to kind of go through and do some of this transformation yourself. The amount of countries that you visualize isn't as big as going through the step of editing the data, at least for the students in my class that are completing this and that will choose to make a map. All right, so here's how I could do it. I could click back on my data model and say edit, and I could go back in here and I could replace those values if I wanted to for country name. You'll see again that a lot of them have been replaced because I've already done this step here in a prior work, but if I wanted to even make that more robust and get all of them, I could do RW for Russia, for example, if I noticed that one wasn't there and I want to see Russia. You know, I'm gonna go through and say, all right, you know, this looks good. Close and load back to. It's gonna update it here. So anything I did to the data there should be updated here. And now I should see Russia on the map if I wanted it to. Okay, it's telling me I can't create a pivot table I can't create a map from this pivot table, so I'm just going to go ahead and say fine. I'm going to copy this data. I'm only going to copy the actual country level data, not the grand total column, because I don't want the grand total. That's not a country. That's for everybody in the world. Still won't let me do it, so let me copy and paste this next to it. There are some things in Excel that are really annoying and that don't always, you know, do it exactly the way you want to, but you can always copy and paste and move things around, and here we go. Now it'll let me do my map. All right, so I've got this basic map here. I can see that the highest average salary actually was from Russia. I'm interested to know what the different roles are and what they might look like. If I update Australia here, if I spelled it correctly, it would have actually shown up on the map. All right, Belize, you can add it here too, and it'll update the map for you. All right, Indonesia should pop up. There we go. All right, so, you know, again, there are different ways that we could add additional data points if we knew all of the countries. So for the purposes of this exercise, though, this is entirely sufficient to get us familiar with understanding that the way in which we edit and import data has an impact on what Excel can do with it. So I will no longer manually edit this because that is what data science and scripting languages like pandas are for. So we will do those steps later. All right, but this is when we're ready. This is our initial map. Okay, so our last chart, for example, for this lecture, I'm going to do a stacked column and bar chart to show the relative ratio of remote work by company size. You know, the interesting thing that I found was that large and small companies had a much higher telework ratio, 50%, than those at medium companies. Medium companies definitely were heavy on the side of more telework overall. So it was just an interesting difference. All right, so let's make that graph, right? So I'm going to go ahead and go and insert tab. I'm going to pull from my data model again. I'm going to put it right here in this worksheet. All right, and let's create a different data table, a data pivot table, a data segment, what have you. We're going to use our company size as our column and our remote ratio as our rows. All right, I'll pull the number of IDs down and I'll say, just tell me the count. Actually, you know what? What if I wanted to do a calculation? Instead of just counting, I want to show the value as a percentage of the overall from a given company. Okay, so to do that here, I would do it from the column total, because in my columns is my company size. So if I want to show how many people are remote by company size, that's what I would select. I'm going to let it know it's a percentage, click OK, and here we go. So now I can see that a large size company, 16% of the people don't work at all remote. 30% do, and about 53% or 100% remote. Awesome. So let's start looking at ways we might want to visually show this data. Okay, that's one. We can see that the large companies are blue. Can see their percentage of remote work. Looks like medium companies have got the highest percentage of overall, medium size of overall telework. You know, there's probably a lot of reasons why that is, but it's either one or the other. It doesn't look like most are half and half. All right, I could do a clustered bar column. This is another way to look at that same data. Okay, let's click OK. Let's go into it. May not love it, but we're just going to get started. So, you know, I actually don't necessarily find this so helpful. It's busy. There's a lot of depth. It takes me a minute to decipher what I'm looking at. So I'm going to actually go up here into my format and design, and I'm going to change my chart type. let me look at this stacked bar column. I kind of like this one. All right, I think that's more where I'm going. So now I've got large companies here. I can see by color is the remote ratio. So large companies, looks like a lot of them, almost 50% do, percentage, 50% of telework is still, it's a significant 60% of large companies telework 50% of the time is where I'm trying to get. All right. So we'll add a title to this really quickly. We'll make sure that it's clear what we're showing here. I'm going to look at these different chart elements, see how I want to lay out my information. Do I want it as a value label in the actual column itself? Do I want it as a table down below? What for me feels best, how I want to represent this information. Make sure and I'll save it, because if I get to this point and I haven't saved it yet, I might be sad. I might want to save continually, but that's my bad. I waited to the end and probably could have done this step by step, just because it is a rather large file to be working with. All right, so I'm gonna make sure I title this, give it my name so that the professor knows who's submitting it, and then I'm gonna call it a day on this assignment. So there's a walkthrough on Module 2, Lab Assignment, Excel Like a Boss. Thanks, folks.